The room wasn't silent because people agreed. It was silent because they didn't expect her to say it. One sentence. No raised voice, no performance. Just a calm, deliberate question from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez that pierced through hours of noise like glass cracking under pressure. If fairness matters, shouldn't we also ask how the former First Lady got her visa? And just like that, everything shifted. Trump exploded online. Headlines twisted the clip. Cable news spun it into chaos. But the truth wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It had already landed. What followed wasn't a scandal. It was a reckoning. One that forced America to ask, why do some get questioned endlessly, while others get a pass for silence? This story may be fictional, but the emotions it reflects, the double standards, the public gaslighting, the quiet courage to ask a forbidden question, those are very real. This is not a reenactment. It's a mirror. Welcome to the moment AOC shattered the narrative without ever raising her voice. The hearing room wasn't built for truth. It was built for theater. Bright fluorescent lights hummed above. Rows of cameras blinked red, locked onto every raised brow and furrowed note card. C-SPAN's live feed glided like a ghost across the panel, scanning each face. Some were performative, some were bored. A few looked like they'd rehearsed their outrage in the mirror that morning. It was the third hour of a hearing titled National Values and Immigration Integrity, a name vague enough to sound noble, sharp enough to be a trap. The Republican chairman, sharp suit and sharper smirk, tapped his mic with the air of someone who liked the sound of his own silence. Before we continue, he said, we must remember who this country belongs to. Real Americans. Not just those who arrive, but those who carry this nation in their blood. He didn't look at her. But then again, he didn't have to. The phrase real Americans hung in the air like smoke after a match strike. Ugly, lingering, dangerous. Across the room, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat motionless. Her pen hovered above a yellow legal pad, ink untouched. From a distance, she looked disengaged, almost distracted. Her eyes flicked between prepared statements and printouts, lips pressed tight, not impatient, not bored, calculating. She'd heard this script before. Different setting, same subtext. They always want to talk about us versus them, she'd once told her staff. But it's never really about borders. It's about control, about who's allowed to ask questions. The camera cut to a smug congressman from Florida, leaning in, voice syrupy with condescension. We cannot afford to water down our foundational values just to be politically correct. Some of us are tired of watching this country get hijacked by narratives that ignore the sacrifices of those who built it. He smiled, this time looking directly at AOC. The room didn't gasp, but it stiffened, ever so slightly. You could hear it in the paper shuffles, in the uncomfortable throat clearings, in the way the stenographer's keystrokes slowed, waiting. AOC didn't react. She reached down, flipped a page. Her hand paused mid-turn, fingers pressing against the paper like they were holding something down. Maybe a fact. Maybe fury. Then she looked up, not slowly, not dramatically, just precisely. She adjusted her mic. Chairman, since we're taking time today to define who belongs and who doesn't, I have one question. No rustle, no whisper, only the click of one pen being capped. If we're revisiting what it means to belong in America, should we also take a closer look at how the former First Lady obtained her visa? Silence. Not the type that begs for explanation, but the type that challenges you not to move. The congressman's face froze in mid-smile, caught somewhere between confusion and calculation. A staffer 2 seats down dropped a highlighter. A cup trembled slightly in someone's hand. Even the C-SPAN camera, usually robotic in its sweeps, seemed to pause, as if unsure whether it was now filming history. AOC's eyes never left the chairman's. No blink, no smirk, no follow-up. The question had been released, and it wasn't coming back. And just like that, the hearing was no longer about policy. It was about what America dares to ask and what it's afraid to answer. The pause after her question didn't feel like dead air. It felt like a wire had been cut. The kind of pause that doesn't wait to be filled. It demands to be felt. Even the temperature in the room seemed to drop by a degree. Nobody looked directly at AOC, and yet everyone did. One pen stopped mid-signature. A coffee stirrer spun idly in someone's forgotten cup. The congressman from Florida opened his mouth, but nothing came out. For a fraction of a second, power changed hands. Not because she yelled, but because she didn't. Someone in the back let out a cough, the kind people used to break tension. Another chuckled too loudly, unsure if they were supposed to. It was the kind of moment that made people want to laugh, because they were nervous, because it was real, because someone had said something they weren't used to hearing out loud. And AOC just sat there. Her expression didn't shift. No gloating, no lean back, no gotcha energy. Her voice hadn't even lifted above a conversational tone. That was the part people would comment on the most. Not the content of her question, but how she said it. Like it was obvious, overdue, and quietly unforgiving. Like she'd been holding that line in her back pocket for months, waiting for the exact second when silence would make it scream. The chairman didn't respond right away. He blinked, once, twice, then shuffled some papers as if trying to summon normalcy back into the room. AOC didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. The question had done its work, not because it accused, but because it exposed, and that was always more dangerous. Backstage, a junior producer at C-SPAN clipped the exchange on instinct. 12 seconds. He didn't even add a title. Just the raw moment. It hit Twitter at 11:46 a.m. By 12:03, it had been reposted 15,000 times. By 12:30, the hashtag #SheJustAsked had entered national trending. It wasn't a movement, not yet, but it was something sticky, something that didn't let go. People weren't just sharing it, they were dissecting it, freezing frames, quoting her tone. One user wrote, "She didn't flinch," and that's what broke them. Another tweeted, "She didn't accuse Melania. She just reminded the room that fairness has a long memory." Conservative media jumped on it fast. Headlines screamed, "AOC attacks Melania's immigration status in shocking hearing." Outburst Democrat Congresswoman questions, First Lady's right to be here. But the clip told a different story. People who watched the full video, those who took the time, could see it. There was no outburst. There was no attack. Just one woman asking the kind of question that tends to get asked only in one direction. And AOC? She didn't tweet, didn't clap back, didn't share a meme or a quote card. She walked out of the hearing room quietly, stopped by her office, and uploaded the full footage to her official channel. No graphics, no hashtags, no edits. Just the hearing, exactly as it happened. 12 seconds in the middle of a 2-hour session. The kind of moment most politicians would have missed or buried. But not her. She let it breathe. Let the public sit with it, uncomfortable and unfiltered. The clip's title was plain, Full Committee Hearing, March 21st. That was it. And yet, it was enough to light a match. Because once people saw it for themselves, they stopped asking what she meant and started asking why no one else had said it first. By mid-afternoon, the storm had a name, and it wasn't Melania. At exactly 2:07 p.m., a post appeared on Truth Social in all caps. Disgusting attack on Melania by AOC. She hates America. No context, no clip, just outrage, ready to be swallowed whole. 15 minutes later came another. She should apologize to the First Lady immediately. This is sick. And that was Trump's rhythm. Fast, loud, and unrelenting. He didn't reference what AOC actually said. Didn't touch the word visa. But he didn't have to. He knew how this game worked. Drown nuance in noise and let the mob do the rest. Melania herself said nothing. Not a word. But that didn't stop her name from trending beside terms like #G modeling visa, #G green card gate, and #G privilege path. Someone dug up old headlines. Others started tracing timelines, jobs, appearances. The internet, when provoked, has a memory like a bloodhound. Meanwhile, in a cramped office 3 floors above the Capitol hearing room, AOC sat with her team. The walls were lined with notes, draft policy sheets, a coffee stain from 3 days ago. Her comms director paced, holding her phone like it was hot. "They're calling it an attack," she said. "We've got cable outlets taking screenshots out of context. Patriot Radio says you suggested deporting her. One staffer suggested they push a clarification statement. Another wanted to go on MSNBC. A third proposed a tweet thread with timestamps, legal references, a side-by-side quote comparison. AOC listened, calm, elbows on the table, fingertips touching, eyes unfazed. Then she spoke. Not rushed, not frustrated, just certain. They want noise, she said, so let's give them clarity instead. And that was that. No thread, no spin. Just the video, the full, uninterrupted clip, posted quietly on her official YouTube, embedded on her website, archived for anyone who cared enough to actually listen. But outside that clarity, the thunder rolled in. By evening, her inbox was splitting at the seams. Hate came in waves. You're a disgrace. Move back to where you came from. Keep your mouth shut or we'll do it for you. Some emails came with subject lines in all caps, stuffed with racial slurs. Some were anonymous voicemails, clipped and broken, like the voice on the other end didn't care to hide, but didn't want to be known either. And yet, threaded between the venom, came something else, something quieter but heavier. Thank you notes, hundreds, from immigrants, from teachers, from veterans, from girls with last names that get mispronounced every first day of class, from mothers whose husbands had been deported for reasons they still couldn't explain to their kids. One message simply read, "She wasn't wrong. She just said what we weren't allowed to." AOC didn't cry. She didn't flinch. She sat by the window that night with a mug of tea, skimming messages like she was brushing her fingers across a pulse. Some letters she flagged for staff to respond to. Others she just read. And some she read twice. Outside, thunder cracked. Not a metaphor. Real storm rolling in over DC. But she didn't move. Because the real thunder, the one she'd caused, wasn't outside the window. It was already inside the country, rumbling not with rage, but with a question no one had answered. Not yet. By the next morning, the story had a face. But it wasn't hers. It was one they'd painted. Conservative talk shows were already in full spin mode before sunrise. Headlines barked from car radios and kitchen televisions, like they'd all been written by the same hand. AOC demands Melania's deportation. Radical left targets First Lady's legal status. Hate-fueled questioning by AOC stuns America. Clips of her voice, trimmed, chopped, yanked from context, played on loop. Gone was the quiet, surgical tone. In its place, they pitched her as shrill, angry, dangerous. The 12-second video had been whittled down to 3, then 2. Some shows didn't even use video, just grainy screenshots and inflammatory subtitles pasted over her face. One radio host declared, "She's not asking a question, folks. She's launching a smear campaign against American women." And yet no one quoted her fully. No one showed the silence that followed, the calm, the restraint. That part didn't fit the story they needed. In her office, staffers scrolled through the noise with clenched jaws and tired eyes. Lane, her longtime aide, muttered, "They're building a straw man so they can burn it on camera." AOC sat cross-legged on the corner of her desk, sleeves rolled to the elbow, hair tied back. Not because of image, but because she had work to do. The backlash didn't surprise her. What surprised her was how fast they'd all agreed to misunderstand her on purpose. It wasn't ignorance. It was choreography. She looked up from a draft statement and said almost softly, "I didn't attack anyone. I asked why fairness scares people so much." Her voice wasn't defensive. It was grounded, like someone tired of pretending the script hadn't already been written for her. Because deep down, she knew this wasn't about Melania. It wasn't even about visas. It was about disruption, about what happens when someone refuses to play the expected role. They wanted her loud. She stayed quiet. They wanted her reactive. She stayed surgical. They wanted outrage. She offered questions. And somehow that was more threatening. Lane put her phone down and asked, "You want us to push a rebuttal piece? Clarify your position on camera?" AOC shook her head slowly, her gaze steady. "Let them yell," she said. "We're not here to echo back their chaos. We're here to ask what no one else will." In a meeting with her communications team later that day, she expanded the thought, not for the cameras, but for her staff. They want to make it about decorum, about tone, because they can't answer the substance. So they manufacture offense and hope we'll play defense. No one spoke for a moment. They all knew she was right. Meanwhile, her public calendar filled with interview requests. Every major network wanted her. Some offered primetime slots. Others dangled panel discussions under the guise of balance, which really just meant shouting over her with talking points. She declined most, accepted one. It was a local interview taped in a modest New York studio. No glamour, no drama, just one-on-one questions. The reporter asked her, "Did you expect people to react this strongly?" She smiled, faintly but firmly. No one flinches like this unless you touch something tender. And apparently, fairness is tender. The segment aired that night with limited reach. But those who watched it knew this wasn't about a first lady. This was about a first crack in a conversation long overdue. And cracks, once exposed, don't just close back up. They widen. They let in light. And that, more than anything, was what they feared. Before there were microphones and hashtags, there were hallways that smelled like bleach and printer ink. Courtrooms with flickering ceiling lights and benches that always seemed too cold. That's where AOC learned how to sit still when others panicked, how to speak plainly when the stakes were high, and how to find the story inside a stack of paperwork that nobody wanted to read. It wasn't politics, it was personal. She had been barely 24 when she started volunteering with legal aid groups in the Bronx, places where cases move fast and lives unraveled faster. The clients weren't rich or famous or protected by handlers. They were housekeepers, dishwasher line cooks, students with part-time jobs and undocumented parents. People whose names were never printed in press releases, whose accents made bureaucrats sigh before they even said a word. One case, though, never left her. And it wasn't the most dramatic, just the quietest. He was 16, Puerto Rican American, had a scar on his left cheek from a bicycle accident, and a folder full of honors math tests. He was pulled off a city bus for what the officer called suspicious behavior, which really just meant he looked tired and brown and didn't respond fast enough. The officer ran his name, found a social security number mismatch, something his mother had filed wrong years ago when trying to fix her own paperwork, and flagged it. ICE got involved within 2 days. They called it administrative review. But in truth, it was a fast-track deportation for a teenager who had never lived anywhere but the Bronx. AOC wasn't even supposed to be assigned the case, but the office was swamped and she offered to help draft motions. The first time she met him, he barely spoke, just sat there gripping the sleeve of his hoodie like it was an anchor. When she asked him what scared him most, he didn't say deportation. He said, "I'll miss my AP exam." That moment hit her harder than anything else that month. Because he wasn't preparing to fight, he was preparing to be erased. In court, she stood next to a licensed attorney and made the argument they'd crafted for hours. She called it what it was, a clerical error being treated like criminal fraud. She said, "You're not applying the law. You're punishing a family for not being perfect." The judge didn't respond, but he didn't sign the removal order either. The teen got deferred status and eventually citizenship. Years later, when a reporter asked AOC why she always kept her cool, why she never yelled back even when they came at her sideways, she mentioned that case. He wasn't a file. He wasn't a headline. He was a life, and I still carry him with me. That experience didn't just shape her tone. It shaped her entire political muscle. Because once you've seen how fragile the truth becomes in a system built to ignore people, you stop performing. You start choosing your words like scaffolding, measured, purposeful, strong enough to hold the weight. So when they came at her now, twisting her question into firewood for talk radio, she didn't lash out. She remembered the courtroom, the silence, the stare across a bench that didn't expect her to stand firm, and that's why she didn't flinch. Because in the Bronx, you don't get applause for saying the right thing. You just get the moment to say it, and then it's gone. She'd learned early, if you don't make that moment count, no one else will. It started with a classroom in Tulsa. Not a university, not a flashy debate stage, just a civics teacher in Oklahoma with 30 folding desks, a whiteboard that hadn't been erased fully in weeks, and a clip she couldn't ignore. Ms. Daniels had taught for 16 years, and she'd long given up trying to get teenagers to care about congressional hearings. But that morning, something in her gut told her to play the clip. She didn't frame it, didn't explain it, just hit play. 12 seconds. The class went quiet. One student leaned forward, another rewound it. One boy asked, "Wait, is she not supposed to say that?" Daniels didn't answer. She just wrote 2 words on the board, double standard, then left the rest of the period open. The discussion lasted until the bell, and then spilled out into the hallway. Because when teenagers see power flinch, they remember. In Phoenix, it wasn't a classroom, it was a sidewalk, and a cardboard sign held by a girl in sneakers 2 sizes too big. Her name was Adriana, 17, the daughter of a mother who had waited 9 years for a green card, only to be denied for a technicality that nobody ever fully explained. Adriana didn't follow politics much, but she followed stories that sounded like hers. And when she watched AOC raise that question, not with rage but with precision, something inside her steadied. The sign she brought to the small protest outside the courthouse read, "If she stays, so should my mom." Simple, crude marker, no hashtags, but raw enough to stop a journalist on their way to a bigger event across the street. By nightfall, the photo had made it to Twitter. No filters, no slogans, just a girl, a sign, and a sentence that couldn't be easily spun. Republicans responded the only way they knew how, louder. The speaker made a statement accusing AOC of weaponizing immigration policy to attack women. A senator called her reckless on morning radio. Trump fired off another post. AOC is out of control. Attacking first ladies now? Sad. Cable news panels exploded with arguments. Was it fair? Was it below the belt? Was she calling for deportation? Was she jealous? But while the microphone screamed, AOC didn't. She was in her office, cross-legged on a couch that had definitely seen better years, sipping cold green tea out of a mug that said, "Nevertheless." Her laptop open, fingers calmly moving across a document titled, "Draft, Equal Transparency in Immigration Act." She wasn't chasing headlines. She was chasing loopholes. One line in the bill read, "No individual in the public trust shall be exempt from documentation review accessible to the general public." Her staff didn't rush her. They knew how she worked. She never wrote to punish. She wrote to protect, quietly, relentlessly. Because to her, this wasn't about winning an argument. It was about building a record, one that would last longer than any viral outrage cycle. Meanwhile, more ripples spread. A debate coach in Des Moines rewrote her semester's final prompt based on the clip. A Vietnamese-American podcaster in California opened her latest episode with a simple phrase, "You don't have to raise your voice to raise a mirror." A muralist in Chicago started sketching the moment, the exact second AOC asked the question, her finger resting on the mic button, eyes forward, unflinching. And through it all, AOC didn't celebrate. Because to her, this wasn't her story catching fire. It was the match finally touching the gasoline. It was just past 6 in the evening when Lane buzzed through on the intercom. Her voice was clipped, but there was something cautious underneath. "There's someone here to see you. No appointment. Says his name is Eli Kwan, AOC, looked up from her desk, where she'd been reworking language on a draft amendment for the 3rd time that hour. The name clicked in slow motion, like a familiar door creaking open after years of silence. "Send him up," she said. She hadn't seen Eli since Oak Park, back when the two of them worked late nights at a legal aid clinic tucked behind a failing community center and a laundromat with broken dryers. He'd been the one with case law at his fingertips and circles under his eyes that never left. She'd been the intern with too many questions and not enough rest. Now he stood in her office doorway, holding a plain manila folder, like it weighed more than it should. His suit was wrinkled. His tie was loose. He looked like someone who hadn't slept, and had chosen not to. "I won't stay long," he said, "but I couldn't sit on this anymore." She didn't ask what it was yet, just motioned for him to come in. He sat carefully, almost like the chair might react. For a few moments, neither spoke. The folder sat between them on the table, sealed at the top with a thin strip of red tape. No label, no markings, just tension. Eli finally broke the silence. "Years ago, I worked on a case that crossed paths with another firm. Nothing major, just background documentation from an old modeling agency. Didn't mean anything at the time. He paused, rubbed his jaw. But then I saw the clip. She knew which one he meant. And I remembered. I remembered because one of the documents in that file had her name on it, Melania's. I tracked it again, just to be sure. Cross-referenced with public records, court dates, archived filings, triple-checked, and there are gaps. Real ones. He slid the folder across the table. Inside scanned immigration forms, sponsor letters, date-stamped visa logs, notes scribbled in the margins from a long-closed agency liaison. One letter in particular stood out, a request for reconsideration of work authorization, dated months after a job contract had already been signed. Eli didn't narrate every piece. He let the silence carry the weight. She flipped through slowly, her thumb steady. This wasn't gossip. It was paper, signed, filed, and ignored. It wasn't proof of fraud, not yet, but it was something very different than the narrative that had been fed to the public. Not elegant, not clean, just quiet evidence that even the immigration system bent, depending on who was standing in front of it. Eli leaned back, voice lower now. You didn't lie, Alexandria. You didn't twist anything. You asked a fair question, and now the entire machine's trying to make you regret it. That's why I'm giving this to you. Not to fight dirty, but to decide what to do when the other side's never had to explain how they played clean. She didn't speak for a few seconds. Her fingers rested gently on the top corner of the folder. Her eyes were still. Her breath was calm. She wasn't angry. She wasn't surprised. She was resolved. Why me? She finally asked. Eli gave a tired smile. Not amused, affirming. Because you're not trying to burn things down. You're just not pretending the house is fair. He stood to leave, and she sat with the folder for a long while after he left. No press release, no dramatic phone call. Just pages, patterns, and the growing awareness that this wasn't about proving anything. It was about showing what was always there, just waiting for someone to stop blinking. They didn't call a press conference. No one dropped a tweet storm. The folder sat unopened on AOC's desk until her entire policy team had finished their rounds for the day, and the office had thinned to a quiet hum of keyboard taps and distant hallway shoes. That's when she brought Lane in and opened it again, not with excitement, but with that steady, anchored attention she reserved for things that mattered more than airtime. Lane scanned the first few documents without speaking, then the next 5. Her brow furrowed. Not in confusion, but in recognition. She'd seen enough visa applications, sponsorship forms, and labor certifications to know what normal looked like. And this didn't look normal. There was no smoking gun, no bolded sentence that screamed scandal. Just a pattern of omissions, contradictions, and timing that didn't make sense unless someone wanted them not to. They spent the next 2 hours making a list. Names of law firms, agencies, approval dates. Then Lane reached for her laptop and started contacting 3 legal contacts. Experts in immigration law from different coasts, different backgrounds, and most importantly, different politics. AOC didn't want confirmation bias. She wanted clarity. Each lawyer got a redacted scan of the file with identifying details removed. No names, just facts, dates, and forms. The responses came back within 24 hours. All 3 flagged the same document. A letter dated October 2001, marked as a request for retroactive employment authorization. The attached affidavit referenced modeling assignments that had already occurred in the U.S. before the authorization was granted. No employer listed, no retroactive penalty disclosed. One of the lawyers wrote back with a single line, "If this were a TPS applicant from Haiti, they'd be detained at JFK." Lane read the note aloud and set the laptop down slowly. And that's when AOC said it, quietly but with no hesitation. "If I was born in Honduras and this was my file, I'd be in deportation court." Lane didn't argue. She knew it was true. They both did, because this wasn't just about immigration paperwork. It was about the double-glazed insulation that privilege creates, the kind that keeps certain people warm and untouched, while others get left standing outside holding every receipt, every form, every fingerprint, praying it's enough. They didn't publish anything that day. They didn't leak it to friendly reporters or drop hints on social media. AOC wasn't interested in weaponizing the documents. Not yet. She was interested in understanding the terrain and whether the truth would collapse on its own if people just had the right map. People are going to say we dug this up out of spite, Lane said. No, AOC replied. We didn't dig. We received, and now we verify. Later that night, when the office was nearly dark and only the cleaning crew remained, AOC stayed at her desk with the letter in front of her. She didn't highlight it or annotate the margins. She just looked at it, like she was memorizing the shape of hypocrisy on paper. It didn't shake her. It just confirmed what she already suspected. The question she'd asked in that hearing hadn't been rhetorical. It had been overdue. And now the answer was sitting on her desk, staring back, line by line. By Thursday morning, the pushback had turned radioactive. What began as spin had mutated into something more bitter, more deliberate. Her voicemail inbox filled up faster than her team could clear it. The usual rants, of course. Rage from conservative callers accusing her of attacking decent women, siding with criminals, pushing her radical immigrant agenda. But some crossed the line, way past it. Messages with clipped, distorted voices, accents faked or hidden, threats dressed up as warnings, a few just heavy breathing followed by slurs. Lane started screening everything. Staff began avoiding the physical mail tray. One envelope had no return address and just the word liar scrawled in red marker across the front. Inside was a blank sheet of printer paper, folded once, like the sender couldn't even find the words. And yet, the worst thing wasn't the violence. It was the way some networks played along. Talk show hosts with plastic smiles and practiced rage replayed her clip, cropped it down, then asked questions they already knew the answers to. Why is she obsessed with Melania? Is this what feminism looks like now? Should we be worried that she wants to control who gets to stay in America? The performance was exhausting, but it wasn't new, so AOC didn't fight the noise. She let it loop, because while the country argued over whether she'd gone too far, they weren't asking the better question. Had anyone else ever dared go that far before? That afternoon, as she sorted through draft language for a coming bill, her phone buzzed, not from a threat, not from a headline, but from her mother. Just a voicemail. Her mother never liked to text. She didn't trust silence unless it came with a voice behind it, so she left a message, as she always did when things got loud. Hey baby, I saw the news. Again, I know how this looks, and I know how they'll spin it. But Mija, listen, truth doesn't always come out clean. Sometimes it's messy, sometimes it bleeds a little, but it does come out, and when it does, it's worth it. Even when they try to scare you out of saying it. AOC played it twice, not for comfort, but for grounding. Her mother had lived through worse than angry headlines. She had raised 2 kids on a server's wage, buried her husband too early, and still managed to show up with tamales and stubborn advice on every campaign stop. That night, AOC sat in her apartment, not the one with a fancy view, but the one with mismatched mugs and the corner plant that still hadn't died. She sipped tea that had gone cold an hour ago and looked over the folder one last time. She didn't feel triumph. She felt tension, but not in her chest, in the system. The quiet stretch before something shifts. Lane messaged her around midnight. Ready for tomorrow? She texted back simply, we're not breaking news. We're breaking silence. And that was the difference. She wasn't dropping a scandal. She wasn't seeking revenge. She was making space for a conversation that had been stapled shut for years. Not because it was dangerous, but because it was inconvenient. So when morning came, she didn't give an exclusive. She didn't go live. She passed the documents, redacted, verified, and footnoted, to 3 journalists who had earned her trust. 1 local, 1 national, 1 immigrant-owned. Let the story speak. Let the facts stand. Let the country decide if it still wanted silence or if it was finally ready to hear itself. The first voice came from a quiet classroom in El Paso. Not a headline, not a politician, just Ms. Aranda, a 3rd-grade teacher with a calm face and a tired smile. She posted the video in the early hours before school started. No ring light, no edits. Just her sitting at her desk with a laminated seating chart half covered by dry erase markers. My students carry papers, she said simply. They carry copies of their birth certificates, school ID cards, guardianship forms, Not because they want to, but because their parents are scared of what happens if they don't. She held up a tiny folder. Neon pink, a cartoon sticker on the front. "This belongs to Mia," she added. "She's 8. She carries it in her backpack every day because her parents have been pulled over twice in the last year." Her voice didn't shake. It didn't rise. She looked straight at the camera and asked the question that didn't need to be screamed to sting. If Mia has to carry proof of her right to exist, why didn't the First Lady? The video didn't explode. It echoed, quietly, steadily, shared among teachers, immigrant parents, classroom aides. It wasn't political, it was maternal. It was real. The next voice came from up north. Andre Colvin wasn't trying to go viral. He was sitting on his back porch outside of Detroit, drinking iced tea from a plastic cup and wearing a faded army shirt that barely held its color anymore. He was 58, had fought in the Gulf, then in Afghanistan, came home to find people still asking where he was really from. He didn't call into radio shows, didn't write op-eds. But that day, after hearing one too many pundits call AOC divisive, he hit record on his phone and said what he'd been biting back for decades. "I've served this country in 2 wars," he said slowly, almost like it hurt. "And every time someone asks me to explain how I got here, it's not curiosity, it's doubt. It's a way of reminding me that some of us have to justify being American every damn day." Then he added, "She asked what I've been holding back for 40 years. That clip hit Facebook like a quiet hammer. No yelling, no music, just the weight of a man who'd done everything right and still knew what it meant to be inspected, not accepted. And then there was Harold. If you weren't from Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, you wouldn't know Harold Sims. But in that town, he'd been cutting hair for 3 decades. Everyone knew him. Local cops, Little League coaches, pastors. His barbershop had only 2 chairs and a stack of outdated sports magazines. But what it lacked in decor, it made up for in memory. When a customer brought up the hearing during a trim, Harold didn't hesitate. "She didn't yell," he said, comb in one hand, clippers in the other. "She didn't lie. She just asked out loud what we've all said in here 100 times." The room went quiet for a moment, not because they disagreed, but because someone had finally put it into words that didn't need volume. Later that night, someone filmed Harold saying it again. Same tone, same posture, same truth. That clip made its way online. And like the teacher and the veteran before him, he wasn't trying to go viral. They weren't raising fists. They weren't storming buildings. They were just speaking, calmly, like the woman who started it all. And that's what made it powerful. It wasn't an army behind her. It was a mirror, reflecting people who had carried these truths quietly for years. And now finally were ready to say them out loud. It began quietly, like most real things do. No chants, no bullhorns, just 15 students sitting cross-legged in the middle of a campus courtyard in Sacramento, California. No spokesperson, no stage, just notebooks, water bottles, and cardboard signs resting gently in their laps. Not one of those signs had a slogan, only questions. Who gets to stumble and stay? Would the rules be different if her last name were Lopez? What does loyalty look like when you're not white? They didn't shout. They didn't explain. They simply sat, in silence, in formation, in the middle of hundreds of students walking to class, eating lunch, pretending not to stare. By late afternoon, photos began surfacing online. TikTok caught it first. Quick pans across faces, close-ups of the handwritten questions. One post went viral, just a 15-second clip of a student holding a sign that read, "My uncle got deported for a typo. What did she get a pass for?" The caption beneath it was simple. #G, same rules, same rights. It caught fire, not because it was loud, but because it was undeniable. By the next day, students across at least a dozen other campuses were staging similar sit-ins. Some lasted 20 minutes. Others went all day. They didn't block traffic or disrupt classes. They just existed, unapologetically, silently, asking the questions no one on TV seemed ready to face. No party affiliation, no name-calling, just markers, cardboard, and collective memory. In Chicago, a Latina pre-med student held up a sign, "My dad overstayed a visa once. I haven't seen him since." In Austin, a Somali American student wrote, Tell me again who gets the benefit of the doubt. I'll wait. The movement grew without an organizer. No central page, no donation link, just stitched TikToks, shared Instagram reels, screenshots passed in encrypted group chats. There was no figurehead, no single voice. And that's exactly why it moved like wildfire. Because it didn't need permission. It already belonged to everyone who had ever been asked to prove what others were allowed to assume. When AOC's team first saw it, someone asked if they should amplify it, repost, tag, issue a statement. But AOC shook her head gently. It's not about me, she said. It's about what we've all seen but didn't say. She watched the clips late into the night. Students in snow, students in heat, students sitting on plastic chairs outside community colleges and art schools and state universities. They weren't quoting her. They were echoing the space her question had cracked open. And she knew better than to stand in the middle of it, hands raised like she started the fire. That's not how fires work. That's not how truth spreads. So she stayed quiet. But inside, she felt something shift. Because for all the years she'd been told to watch her tone, mind her words, be careful not to alienate. What she was seeing now was something they never warned her about. What happens when people stop waiting for permission to be honest? One of her staffers brought her a report the next morning. Social engagement stats, trending metrics, regional breakdowns. She skimmed it, then pushed it aside. She didn't need data to tell her what she already felt. The silence wasn't passive, it was powerful. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't the one speaking. She was listening. There was something unusual about how the clip was being played. It wasn't dressed up. It wasn't chopped or paired with dramatic music. Local news stations from Fresno to Birmingham began running it during evening broadcasts, unedited, without voiceover, without pundit reaction. Just the moment, the sentence, the silence that followed. Anchors would simply say, "Here's what Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said during a recent hearing," and then let the footage speak for itself. And it did. In living rooms across the country, people paused mid-bite, looked up from their phones, or lowered the volume on their blenders to catch it. Not because they expected fireworks, but because something in the delivery demanded stillness. She wasn't accusing. She wasn't condemning. She was asking. And somehow that unsettled more than any accusation could have. In a debate club meeting at a public high school in Indianapolis, the faculty advisor paused their scheduled session and asked the students to watch the clip. Then he asked a single question. Was she wrong to ask? What followed wasn't a shouting match. It was a layered, awkward, necessary unpacking. One student said, "If it's true, why is everyone so mad she brought it up?" Another added, "We always talk about fairness, but only after people get hurt." Across the state at a community college in Birmingham, a political science professor began her lecture not with a slide, but with the clip. After it played, she turned to her students and said, "Let's talk about who gets questioned and who gets trusted, and how those decisions are made long before paperwork ever comes into play." It wasn't the kind of lesson that showed up on exams, but it stuck. Clips from classrooms started circulating online. Not the hearing itself, but the conversations it sparked. A student in Fresno posted a selfie with the caption, "We paused our whole class to talk about one sentence. I can't stop thinking about it." In a Boston library, a book club swapped that month's novel for a discussion on immigration policy and public perception. In Toledo, a librarian added the clip to their media literacy seminar with a sign that read, "Context is everything." And through it all, AOC said very little. When asked by a local reporter whether she planned to comment on how her question had reached campuses and classrooms, she smiled lightly and said, "You don't need a podium to start a conversation, just a question people can't forget." She knew better than to insert herself into every headline. This wasn't about brand. It was about breath, how truth travels when it's not gasping to be heard over the noise. Her staff noticed the shift too. Messages from school administrators, librarians, even parent associations started showing up in the office inbox. One came from a principal in rural Kentucky who admitted, "I didn't vote for you. Still might not. But my teachers are using that clip because it made our kids ask better questions. That matters." That mattered to her too. In an era obsessed with virality, what was happening felt slower. more durable. This wasn't trend, it was traction. Not just something that people reacted to, but something they revisited. And while political news cycles spun on, the clip endured. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was precise. Like a pin pushed gently into a map, marking a place everyone thought they knew, until they were asked to look again. And that was the quiet power AOC understood better than most. Not every moment needs to roar. Some change the world just by refusing to be forgotten. It didn't come from a press briefing, a major network, or even a breaking news tweet. It came from a podcast with a modest following, hosted by a former journalist named Brian Voss, who recorded from a converted attic and introduced every episode with a simple line: "Let's say what no one's paid to say." The upload dropped just after 8 a.m. on a gray Thursday. No teaser, no warning, no guest name in the episode title. Just episode 147, The Silence Around Power. Most listeners didn't think much of it until 3 minutes in, when the voice of Sonia Lavelle came through the mic. Not many people remembered her name, but inside Washington, Sonia had been known as one of Melania Trump's longest-serving personal aides. Scheduling, press coordination, travel support. She was there for nearly every public appearance, and most private ones too. She hadn't spoken publicly in years, not even to promote her memoir, which had been quietly shelved. But that morning her voice sounded different, measured, worn in, like someone carrying something too long. "I never thought I'd be doing this," she began, "but what I saw happen to Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez this week, it made me feel like silence was complicity, and I've already stayed silent long enough." Brian let her talk. She didn't accuse. She didn't dramatize. She simply recounted. "There were always questions," she said, "about timelines, about paperwork. I remember in 2001, when a European magazine started digging into Melania's modeling history, she got really nervous. She kept saying, 'I don't want people going through my papers.'" Brian asked carefully, "Are you saying she admitted to working in the U.S. before having legal authorization?" Sonia paused, then answered, not with bombast, but with truth. "I'm saying the visa timeline didn't add up, and we all knew it didn't, but no one wanted to be the one to say it out loud. So we just stopped asking." That sentence broke the internet before lunch. Clips of the episode flooded social media. The quote was reposted with subtitles, reaction videos, translated memes. One user wrote, "The former First Lady's own aide just confirmed what AOC merely hinted at." Within hours, the quote topped global trends. "We just stopped asking." Even major outlets that had been cautious began circling back. CNN covered the podcast segment in a midday special. BBC translated it into 5 languages. Univision aired a panel asking what this could mean for the broader conversation on immigration and public trust. Meanwhile, conservative media scrambled. Some tried to discredit Sonia. Disgruntled, out for attention, irrelevant. Others doubled down on attacking AOC. "She set this whole thing up," one host claimed, without evidence. But the needle was already moving, because Sonia wasn't known for drama, and she wasn't known at all for speaking out. That was the difference. Her voice didn't sound political. It sounded tired, honest, human, and the country, exhausted by shouting matches and manufactured rage, listened. AOC didn't post a reaction. When asked by a reporter on Capitol Hill later that afternoon if she had heard the podcast, she nodded once and replied, "I listened. That's all I'll say." And truly, she didn't need to say more, because the echo had already left her hands. Now other people were filling in the rest, not for her, not in her defense, but because the question she asked had finally started unraveling the silence they'd all accepted for far too long. The shift didn't start with a headline. It started with a footnote. An independent legal blog, barely known outside niche circles, posted a breakdown of Melania Trump's early visa records using the documents Eli Kwan had surfaced and AOC's team quietly verified. The post didn't accuse, it analyzed. But the title said everything. The dates don't match. Within 12 hours, it was picked up by the Washington Post's fact-checking team, then by Reuters, then ProPublica. What began as a viral moment fueled by Sonia Lavelle's podcast had now moved into the one realm Melania's defenders couldn't meme away: documentation. Line by line, form by form, analysts found the same pattern. Modeling jobs listed in European press before the visa stamp date, a 2001 letter, already confirmed as real, asking for retroactive work authorization, a rare and highly scrutinized request, a timeline of entry and exit dates that raised red flags under standard procedures. CNN aired a quiet segment with two former USCIS officials. One spoke plainly, if this were a student from Nigeria, they'd be denied, no second chances. The clip wasn't flashy, but it got shared over 1 million times because the truth didn't need sparkle. It had gravity. Even Fox News had to address it, though their framing leaned defensive. AOC weaponizes paperwork to target Melania. But the story had outgrown the pundit circle, because this time, it wasn't about what AOC said, it was about what the papers said. A retired immigration officer, George Riley, 34 years of service, posted a quiet video from his kitchen. No lighting crew, no background music, just a printed copy of Melania's visa timeline laid out on his counter. I've reviewed thousands of cases just like this. Anyone else? Flagged? Denied? Possibly deported? The silence that followed in his video said more than the statement. AOC, for her part, didn't do victory laps. When a reporter cornered her in the Capitol corridor with a question about the documents, she simply replied, "If I asked the wrong question, why did the paperwork answer it?" That line made it to late-night monologues, yes, but it also made it into law school lectures and immigrant advocacy trainings. Suddenly, the tone had shifted, not from anger but from unease. Americans who had long told themselves the system was fair if you follow the rules were confronted with proof. The rules bent, but only for some. Republican lawmakers tried pivoting. This is an attack on the First Lady. This is a stunt. But by then, the narrative wasn't about who AOC questioned. It was about why that question stung. Because every immigrant watching knew, if they had modeled before approval, if they had filed late, if they had gaps in their paperwork, they'd never have been granted a platform, let alone citizenship. AOC posted a single update that night. No caption, just a photo of her old office wall from her public defender, Days in the Bronx. A sticky note on the board. Paper doesn't lie, but silence lets it. No drama, no spin, just a reminder. This wasn't about punishing Melania. It was about revealing the double doors that let some walk through and others wait forever outside. And now that the papers were speaking, America was finally listening. There were no fireworks, no viral montage, just a podium, a seal, and a woman who didn't raise her voice because she didn't have to. The room was packed for the weekly briefing, not because something new had dropped, but because something old had returned with new weight. Reporters who had once chuckled at the immigration exchange between AOC and Melania now leaned forward, pens ready, not for spectacle but substance. She stepped up with her usual composure, gray suit, minimal notes, eyes steady. She didn't mention Sonia Lavelle. She didn't mention the documents. She didn't name names or swing at headlines. She just said this: if one group must follow every rule, then every group should. That was it. But this time the line didn't sound rhetorical. It sounded judicial. It carried the rhythm of precedent. In the silence that followed, no one yelled. No one interrupted. And then in a rare moment for Capitol briefings, the room filled with quiet, respectful applause. Not thunderous, but unmistakably real. Because by now, the facts had landed. The podcast, the legal breakdowns, the unsealed letter, the quiet confessions, the paper trail too clean to deny, everything had converged. And the line AOC had said at the very beginning, once dismissed as political theater, was now being quoted in editorial headlines, in classrooms, on protest signs, even by Republicans trying to distance themselves from the fallout. The public had caught up to the moment. Even centrists, once cautious to engage, now nodded publicly. A moderate senator from Colorado said in a morning interview, "It's hard to argue with fairness." A Chicago pastor echoed on local radio, "That's scripture, not politics." On TikTok, a veteran posted a stitch with her line overlaying a picture of his old uniform and a denied naturalization application for his cousin. Caption, All we ever asked for was the same finish line. AOC didn't claim victory. She moved on to the next part of the amendment. She knew the game would shift again. That backlash would find another angle. But in this moment, the silence around selective enforcement had cracked. And not by scandal, but by calm, by consistency, by the same sentence repeated until the country finally heard it for what it really meant. After the briefing, a young journalist followed her out to ask a last question. "Do you feel vindicated?" She turned slightly, smiled, not smugly, but like someone who understood storms. It was never about vindication, it was about visibility. She stepped into the corridor, aides flanking her, whispers in tow. That line wouldn't trend, but it would stick, because now the story wasn't about whether AOC had gone too far. It was about how long everyone else had stopped short. No press conference, no Instagram live, no cameras catching the curve of her brow as she walked into the Judiciary Subcommittee room that Tuesday morning. Just quiet footsteps and a folder. Inside, the first draft of the High-Profile Immigration Transparency Act. 3 pages. Crisp language. No fiery slogans, no partisan digs. Just policy. Sharp, surgical, intentional. It wasn't the kind of bill people expected from her. It didn't shout. It didn't name anyone. But it did something far more dangerous in D.C. It removed the fog that protected privilege. 3 key provisions, nestled in the text like calm demands. No sealed immigration files for public figures once they enter national office or gain spousal access to federal influence. No retroactive work authorization if that same retroactivity would have been denied to an ordinary applicant. A publicly accessible timeline for naturalization, visa, and adjustment of status history, if the person's image or name has been used to promote national policy. No loopholes, no drama, just light. In the early hours of that week, she met with staff from both sides. Quietly, no press leaks, no name tags in coffee shops. And something unexpected happened. People listened. A Republican from Utah reviewed the draft and said, "My district doesn't love you, but they'd respect this." He slid his initials onto the sponsor list. Another moderate from Pennsylvania, who'd clashed with her on energy reform, leaned back in her office chair and murmured, "It's hard to argue with the sun." By Thursday, 5 co-sponsors had joined. 2 Republican, 1 independent, 1 libertarian-leaning Democrat, and a Southern conservative whose constituents had long demanded transparency for all, not just the poor. The irony wasn't lost on AOC's team. Lane whispered over coffee, "Funny how fairness is only radical when it's applied up." AOC just nodded. That's the whole point. Outside, media still swirled with headlines about Melania, old visa photos, podcast snippets, and late-night segments. But inside those marble hallways, something else was moving, a shift no segment could quite capture. The whispers weren't about scandal anymore. They were about structure. And while opponents scrambled to reframe her as vindictive or opportunistic, she stayed in drafting rooms. Paragraphs, not posts. When a junior aide asked why she hadn't gone public yet, she replied, "Because shouting gets attention. But systems only change when you write the new rules down, where they can't be ignored." She tapped the folder again. That evening, in the hallway outside her office, a longtime Capitol custodian stopped her mid-step. "Heard you're making some folks nervous," he said, grinning. "Only the ones who forgot the rules," she smiled back, and kept walking. It didn't feel like a win, not yet. It felt like building scaffolding, one beam at a time, for a house she knew she might not live in. But someone would, and that was enough. The studio lights were cooler than expected. No sweat, no glare, just a steady wash of white. The host leaned forward with the practiced calm of someone used to dodging controversy, but tonight felt different. It wasn't a segment about ratings. It was about reckoning. The Chiron read simply, "The Truth Seat, Representative, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez." Halfway through the interview, after the policy questions, the deflections from old clips, the "what would you say to your critics" routine, the host exhaled and leaned in. "Congresswoman, you've gotten threats, backlash, even pressure from your own party. Was it worth it?" A beat of silence. Not dramatic, just full. Then AOC's voice, even and unapologetic. They tried to define me by their discomfort. I just defined the problem. There was no applause in the studio. It wasn't that kind of show. But the clip would later echo across social media like a gong through a canyon. Within hours, the quote was printed on t-shirts, bumper stickers, dorm room posters. She didn't smile after saying it. She just blinked once, then adjusted the cuff of her blazer. The host shifted awkwardly, caught between admiration and unease. Some say this is about targeting individuals, that it sets a precedent for personal politics. AOC didn't flinch. No, this is about visibility. If the law asks for transparency, it should never wear a blindfold when it gets uncomfortable. This isn't personal. It's public accountability. The host tried again. But it feels personal. She gave a soft, knowing nod. That's the trick, isn't it? To make policy feel personal only when the person in power is the one being questioned. Immigrants don't get to cry privacy. They cry in interviews, on record, in chains. I just asked a question they couldn't laugh off. The camera zoomed in slightly, unplanned. The producer in the control room would later admit, it felt like truth. You don't cut away from that. And AOC kept going. They wanted me loud so they could call me angry. They wanted me quiet so they could call me irrelevant. What they didn't expect was a calm voice with documents and time. Her words weren't fireworks. They were friction matches. Quiet, small, but enough to light something bigger. The host leaned back, his usual rhythm slightly off. What comes next? AOC shrugged gently. Not indifference, intention. Maybe nothing. Maybe something. But I know this. When people see how thin the rules are for the powerful, they start asking who the rules were actually built for. There was no defiance in her tone, just exposure. Like pulling back curtains, not to shame the room, but to let the light in. After the taping backstage, her staff said little. Lane passed her a tea and nodded. No fanfare, just the quiet after something honest. By morning, her quote topped online searches. College students screen-printed hoodies. A tattoo artist in Oakland inked it on a teacher's forearm. A cafe in Tucson put it on their chalkboard sign. They tried to define me by their discomfort. I just defined the problem. Later that day, an anchor on a rival network dismissed the interview as calculated softness. But even he couldn't avoid replaying the clip. Because there are moments when someone doesn't need to yell to be heard. They just need to say what everyone else is scared to name. And that night, in a seat built to challenge her, AOC didn't defend herself. She defined the silence. And then she filled it. It started with one wall. In a small Bronx community center, just around the corner from where AOC held her first neighborhood forum, a local youth group painted her quote across faded brick in bold yellow letters. If one group must follow every rule, then every group should. They didn't ask for permission. They didn't wait for funding. They just painted. And the next morning, seniors lined up beneath it, waiting for free tax help, nodding quietly at the words like they'd been written in the air long before they landed on a wall. By the end of the week, there were more. A child care co-op in Dallas, a library in Fresno, the site of a barber shop in East LA. All with variations of her words, some painted carefully, others scrawled in graffiti script, but all carrying the same spirit. Fair doesn't mean soft. Fair means consistent. Silence isn't neutral, it's just safer. For some, we don't need louder rules. We need equal ones. In Minneapolis, a group of Somali American teens painted one in 3 languages. In Alabama, a retired pastor stenciled one beside his church's food pantry door. In Arizona, migrant workers passed around a phone with her, quote, translated by hand. And AOC, she didn't repost any of them. She saw them, but she didn't claim them. That morning on her way to a local bookstore event, a woman in her 60s waved her down at the corner of East 138th. Her eyes were tired but clear. You're her, right? The woman asked. No hostility, just memory. AOC nodded. The woman stepped closer, quieter now. My brother got deported for a typo. They said he didn't check the right box. We begged. Nothing. He died last year, still trying to come back. She paused, hand on her heart. You said what I never could. AOC didn't reach for comfort. She didn't reach for defense. She looked the woman in the eye and said simply, "You were never wrong." Just unheard. For a long beat, the woman didn't say anything. Then she whispered, "That's worse sometimes." And AOC replied, "Only if it stays that way." They stood in silence, surrounded by traffic and afternoon heat, as two young girls passed by snapping photos of a new mural being touched up on the side of a youth center. AOC didn't pose with them. She just smiled softly as the older woman walked away, lighter than she came. That evening, Lane showed her an email thread from a high school in South Carolina. Their civics class had chosen her quote for a hallway project. The subject line read, "Words that changed our questions." That night, instead of drafting a tweet, AOC opened a blank document and typed, "Justice isn't volume. It's repetition, not in slogans, but in echoes." She saved the file, closed the laptop, sat still. Later that week, a columnist from a conservative outlet begrudgingly admitted on air, "She didn't call for anyone's head. She just pointed to the rules and asked if they still mattered. Turns out, people are still listening." And they were, but not just with their ears. They were painting, repeating, writing, whispering. And that might have been the loudest thing of all. The folding chairs were mismatched. The gym smelled faintly of old sneakers and new paint. And the only lighting came from flickering fluorescence overhead. There were no cameras, no press, no teleprompters. Just a scratchy mic on a rolling stand and 100 high school seniors sitting cross-legged on the floor, hoodies half-zipped, sneakers tapping, phones tucked away for once, not by rule but by instinct. AOC stood in front of the basketball hoop, no podium between her and the students. Her blazer was slightly wrinkled from the train ride. Her heels had been swapped out for black flats. She wasn't here for a photo op. She was here because someone on staff had flagged the school's quiet letter. "Our students are listening. We just don't know if they believe what they hear." She began without introduction. "I've stood in rooms where people yell over each other for hours and say nothing. And I've stood in silence that told the truth in one breath." A few heads tilted, a few notebooks open, not because they were asked, but because something in her tone made them want to remember what was coming. She paced slowly, not out of nerves, out of intention. "They'll call you angry for asking why," she said. "Ask anyway." A girl in the second row raised an eyebrow. A boy with locks leaned in. "They'll say you're divisive for pointing to the crack in the ceiling while the plaster's falling. They'll ask you to wait your turn while they repaint over the damage." The room was still in the way young people get when they're deciding whether you're real. "I'm not here to ask you to vote. I'm not even here to tell you what to think. I came to remind you, questions are not violence. Doubt is not disloyalty. And your anger, if it's rooted in truth, is not your flaw. It's your compass." No applause, not because they weren't moved, but because clapping would have felt too grown up, too rehearsed. Instead, someone whispered, "Damn," under their breath. She continued, "I've been called ungrateful by people who inherited everything, called extreme by people who excuse injustice as tradition. But let me tell you what's really radical. Believing the rules should apply equally. Believing power should come with transparency, not immunity. Believing that if a teenager gets deported for a paperwork mistake, then a model-turned first lady should too, if the mistake is the same." Some students nodded, some didn't move, but no one looked away. Most of you weren't old enough to vote when the question started, but you were old enough to notice the silence that followed. You've seen who gets second chances, and who gets second interviews, and who gets second searches at the airport. There was a pause, not for effect, but because it was needed. Then she asked, "How many of you have ever watched someone stay quiet because they thought their voice would cost too much?" Hands slowly went up. Not all, but enough. She looked around, and her voice softened. "I wish I could promise you fairness. I can't. But I can tell you this. Courage isn't a title. It's a choice. And if you're waiting for someone else to make it first, you'll be waiting a long time. So be first, even if your voice shakes, even if your hands sweat, even if they call you too much." The bell rang outside. Lunch period. A staffer signaled they were running over time. AOC nodded but didn't rush. "I'm leaving you with one question," she said, stepping back toward the mic. When history asks what we tolerated in our time, will your silence be part of the answer? Then she left. No autographs, no flash. Just a quiet hallway, the shuffle of sneakers, and a buzz in the gym that didn't fade. Someone muttered, "She didn't even post about this." Another replied, "She didn't need to." Because sometimes the most important speeches aren't the ones that trend. They're the ones that echo. The event had ended. The folding chairs were being stacked, the janitor sweeping chip crumbs near the bleachers, and staff members whispered quick thank yous before shuffling AOC toward the gym exit. The buzz was fading, replaced by the familiar after-silence of a school that had just witnessed something more than a guest speaker. She walked slowly, her bag slung over one shoulder, her blazer folded neatly over her arm. She didn't look tired, just thoughtful. And that's when the student approached. Quiet steps, hoodie sleeves tugged over the palms, no phone in hand, no selfie request, just a folded note, slightly crumpled, offered wordlessly. AOC took it gently. The student didn't wait for a response, just gave a small nod, then turned and slipped back through the hallway doors like smoke. She unfolded the paper. The handwriting was uneven, the ink a little smudged. One sentence. "I thought I had to stay quiet. Thanks for showing me I don't." She stood still in the hallway. Didn't speak, didn't blink quickly to keep from crying. She smiled, slow, firm, proud. Because it wasn't about the number of retweets. It wasn't about poll bumps or trending hashtags or who got the best clapback. It was this. A voice that didn't know it had permission. A voice that now might never go silent again. She tucked the note into the inside pocket of her bag, not because it needed safekeeping, but because it didn't belong to the headlines. It belonged to the reason she walked into politics in the first place. Later that evening, on the train back to D.C., she sat by the window with the Capitol slowly nearing in the distance. She didn't post anything on social media, no filtered shot of the gym, no quote overlay, but she scribbled something in her journal just beneath the clipped article of the immigration bill she had introduced the week before. Change doesn't always look like a speech. Sometimes it looks like a piece of lined paper handed off without a word. And as the train rocked forward into the night, she thought about all the students across the country who had questions but were told to wait, who had opinions but were taught to water them down. She thought about the quiet girl in the Bronx who once sat in the back of class, too embarrassed to speak her mind in AP government. And now the grown woman that girl had become was sparking something in another quiet girl halfway across the country. The note didn't come from a headline, it came from a human. And that, she knew, was how history actually changed, not with lightning, but with kindling. A spark, a sentence, and the courage finally to speak. The headlines faded, as they always do. Cable shows moved on to the next scandal, the next distraction. Social feeds filled back up with celebrity feuds, sports updates, debates that felt like déjà vu. But underneath the noise, something lingered. Barbershops still replayed the clip, not for drama, but for the pause that followed AOC's question. In a university in North Carolina, a professor asked her class, "Why do you think that silence went viral?" In a diner in Missouri, two veterans argued over policy, but agreed on one thing. She didn't lie, she just didn't flinch. The bill high-profile Immigration Transparency Act wasn't flashy. No press tour, no partisan fireworks. But names began to appear beside hers. Quiet co-sponsors, ones you wouldn't expect, ones who had always played it safe until the silence made them listen. In committee, staffers whispered, "It's picking up steam." No grand speeches, just momentum. And still, in inboxes and mail bins across AOC's office, came letters. Some handwritten, some printed from hospital waiting rooms, church basements, school libraries. One line kept recurring, "I didn't know someone in power could sound like that." She didn't respond to all of them, but she read everyone. She marked one with a star. It came from a 19-year-old in Fresno. "I used to think truth to power meant shouting, but you just asked a question, and it made everything shift." Weeks later, the amendment passed committee with bipartisan support, no fanfare. But the floor staff smiled more than usual that morning. And as the Capitol dome caught the last of the afternoon sun, AOC walked down the steps. Not hurried, not waving, just steady. Voice calm, posture clear. She wasn't followed by cameras, only by an idea that had taken root in quiet places. As her heels clicked on the marble, a voiceover formed, not for the crowd, but for the country still listening beneath the headlines. They thought I wanted to tear down. I only wanted truth to stand up. And this time it did. What resonates most in this story isn't just AOC's courage, it's her restraint. In a culture obsessed with noise, she used silence as her loudest tool. Her question didn't accuse, it revealed. And in doing so, she reminded us that dignity can be disruptive, that truth doesn't need theatrics to be undeniable. What she offered wasn't a takedown, it was a mirror. And across classrooms, barbershops, and congressional halls, people saw something reflected back. Themselves, unanswered, finally heard. Question for you. Have you ever witnessed a moment where someone's calm, not their volume, changed everything? What did it leave you thinking about long after the moment passed? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Alexandria Rising Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Alexandria Rising Stories.